Hello there, Lothar here. This is the second video on the gear for the big three, and it's going to focus on sleep systems. I am basically going to advise you again to look at the HalfwayAnywhere PCT hiker surveys. I will put the link here. It is a great resource and it lists all the common sleep systems that hikers use on the Pacific Crest Trail. I'm going to talk about the things that are all the variables that are important to me and the kind of kit I use on trail when I'm through hiking. So I'm going to kick off with sleep systems. Now I'm going to refer to notes every so often, so apologies if I look away. And I've got various items of gear as examples that I will pull up as the discussion continues. Okay, let's think about what are the worst conditions you've got to deal with. Now, as in the previous video, I mentioned that on the PCT, the harshest conditions you're probably going to deal with are going to be through the Sierra. And so that kind of puts a limit on what kind of temperature conditions you're going to have to basically deal with at night. Now, if you were to look at the surveys and general discussions, the most hikers will settle on a sleep system that is based around a temperature rating of probably about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that's common. Some people might go slightly higher, some people might go slightly lower, but that seems to be the middle of the range that people look for when they're deciding their gear. Now, you can also discuss or consider whether or not you're going to go for a bag or a quilt, or are you going to go for synthetic fill or down fill? And these are the things we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. So I'm going to look at my notes. Temperature ratings I choose. Now, as I said, 20 is the middle of the range. I personally go for a 10 degree Fahrenheit sleep system. That's personal choice. Now, I have, by way of example, I have a 20 degree synthetic bag here. It's just in its mesh bag, so it's not compressed when I'm storing it long term. And I have my through hiking 10 Fahrenheit degree quilt system. And I will through hike with the quilt, I will car camp and maybe weekend camp with the synthetic. There is a notable difference in weight whether or not you go for synthetic or down. That is what you're paying for to a large degree, and also you get better insulation with down, but you also have associated problems with down. So let's kick off. Why did I go for a 10 degree when the average is 20? Well, there's a full expectation that over the course of the hike, the temperature rating will gradually reduce as the bag gets soiled with my sweat and things like that. I fully expect the fact that if I use a single skin tent like a duplex, as I mentioned in previous videos, then occasionally there's going to be situations, in very cold situations, where I might want to open the doors and have an airflow. So I'm going to probably want an extra little bit of warmth. So the choice of having a single skin tent kind of reflects on the fact that I go for a 10 degrees slightly lower because I also hike very early sometimes, so I go through the Sierra when it's colder and there's lots of snow around, so I'm fully expecting that I'm going to have to manage a lot of condensation in cold conditions, and that's why I go for a 10 degree system. I was referring to my notes. Why do I go for a quilt rather than the bag on trail? Now, it's kind of a choice. You'll see people using bags and they'll say they're perfectly happy. They'll see people using quilts and they'll say they're perfectly happy. I choose a quilt because it's basically, you couple that with your sleeping pad, so therefore you don't necessarily need insulation around when you're sleeping underneath. So that's the pad is doing that because you couple the quilt to a pad system. I like the flexibility that I can have a 10 degree quilt. I can really sort of tighten it around me and feel very warm and comfortable, or I can have it loose and really as a blanket when it starts warming up later on in the trail. I love the flexibility of a quilt. But word of warning, if you've never used a quilt before, they can be frustrating early on until you get it dialed in. You normally have to work out where your straps are going to go around the pad. You will find that occasionally you might find there's a draft coming in. And that can be frustrating, and some people get demoralized by quilts if they're not willing to spend the time, or they just find them problematic. It took me a while to get my quilt dialed in, I'll be honest with you. For a couple of times I thought, oh, why am I using a quilt? For the first time. I will never go back to a bag for a through hike. I choose. It's not ideal for cowboy camping, so if you predominantly want to do cowboy camping, then maybe a bag is a better choice for you. The other thing is that you have to consider when you're potentially, if you're choosing a temperature rating of down or synthetic, would you maybe go slightly higher, maybe a 30, but then couple that in with a liner that you might have located, sent to you before you enter the Sierra, because you know it's going to be cold. That's another way of dealing with the temperature. So you've got maybe a 30-degree quilt or a 30-degree bag through the desert, but to be word of warning, desert nights can be very cold anyway. Some people might have a 30-degree bag that they think, oh, it's probably, I want to use that, or I don't want to spend too much more money on a sleep system, but they might buy a liner to get you down to 20 or 10. And people might also use silk liners to stop soiling. I personally avoid using liners of any kind. I'd rather have a sleep system that works standalone. And one thing I do is I have a layer of clothing such that my body oils don't seep into the fabric and the fill when I'm sleeping on trail. So that's a personal choice, but you may be influenced by the fact if you've already got a piece of gear that may not be perfect, but you can make it perfect from a temperature rating by adding a liner. I fully understand why people might do that and save some money there and put your money towards the backpack or the tent. That's another way of thinking about it. Now the other thing is that when I choose down gear, I tend to really take the approach that I'm going to look after it. I'm really going to look for it as a long-term life purchase. Now, it just so happens that this quilt I bought 4 years ago. It has a down fill. And this has done, wait for it, 3 full through hikes and 80% of a fourth. So 3.8 through hikes. This is the same quilt. I wash it at the end of every hike very carefully, and it is 10 degree and it's still going. So I do take care of my gear. And this is the 4th season for a full 10 Fahrenheit down quilt. Now, if I, to be honest, if I do purchase something synthetic, this is a synthetic bag, this is a 20 degree. I don't treat synthetic gear very often because I don't think it lasts very well. I think a lot degrades over time. If you're not one of these people who really takes care of their gear, then maybe a synthetic might be a better choice. But if you're thinking of a long-term purchase, I would go with down every time as a life. I always think down gear as a long-term purchase if your budget can extend to it. The other thing that I use to extend the lifetime of my gear or my sleep system are these things. These are booties. Now you might think, why do you wear booties? Well, 2 reasons. One, they are very loose fitting and they're great for feet recovery, so they're not like a tight sock when I'm sleeping. They're lovely and warm. The second primary reason I use these when I'm sleeping every night is that they keep my dirty feet away from the fabric of my sleep or quilt, in particular in this case. So these are great for keeping the endurance and stopping your footbed of your sleep system, be it a bag or a quilt, from being soiled day after day or night after night as you through hike, and then you have to wash it. It can get really smelly and clammy down there if you don't use something like this. You might think this is a luxury. It's not. It's looking after my feet. It's great feet recovery. So I have my feet loose in these. Any dirt stays in here, and these are easy to wash. These are synthetic fill, and they really add to the longevity of my sleep system. Just protecting it. So personal choice. And they're easy to wash as well because these are synthetic. So I actually tend to wash these on trail quite regularly, but I very rarely have to wash my my sleep system on trail, and I'll talk about that in a minute if you have to do that. Okay. Okay. The second thing is, as I've said, you must take care of down gear. It's a little bit more. As I said, synthetic can take more abuse. Another factor to consider, or other factors to consider, if you are going to go for down gear, you might go for a certain temperature rating. I would also go for whatever the maximum fill power that the manufacturer is offering. So it's 500, 600, 700 or whatever. If your budget can afford it, try and go as high as you can, because again, I take these as a long-term purchase. And this particular one also has waterproofing on the down. Now, a while ago, a lot of manufacturers offer treated down, and that means it's hydrophobic, which means it sort of doesn't absorb water. If there's moisture in the air, or if you actually splash water on a down quilt, the down will normally absorb it. And if you have treated down, it potentially, arguably, doesn't absorb the water quite so quickly. Some manufacturers and some tests were done, reports I saw where it was shrouded doubt on whether or not this coating of the down actually does anything. Is it really effective? And some manufacturers stopped doing it. The difficulty here is that I have down treated quilt here just by my feet. I have down a waterproof treated down in one of my puffy jackets, and I had a waterproof treated down in one of my sleeping bags. Qualitatively, and this is I do apologise that I can't put any numbers on this, that over the time I've used treated down, I personally have found that I think it does make some difference. I can't put a number on it. I think when I'm moving through the misty, if I'm hiking early in the morning and it's misty, my puffy jacket doesn't seem to absorb water as much as my previous puffy jacket. I appreciate it's not the same conditions in the same time frames, but I do think that if I was given the choice to have a waterproof treated down on one of my pieces of kit, be it a puffy jacket or my sleep system, I would take it if it was an option. But I can't quantitatively say scientifically that it is better. It's just purely my qualitative impressions and experience. I kind of think it does something, but I can't put a number on it. Anyway, that's one of those choices you might have to make. I'm just checking my notes here. When you do get a sleep system of any kind, make sure the manufacturer sends you the stuff sack, so you can obviously compress it down so when you're camping, but also make sure they send you either one of these storage bags, such that whenever you're storing it at home or long term, you're storing it in one of these big lofty bags, so you're not compressing the down or the synthetic fill long term. If they don't offer you a mesh bag, write them a nasty letter and say, send me a mesh bag. If they're selling a quality system, all manufacturers normally send you one of these storage bags. What other thing? Yeah, the other thing I would do on trail when I'm hiking along is that whenever you go to a laundromat, I would always try and when you're in the drying cycle of the gear and you finished out, I'd probably take my down quilt and put it into the laundromat on very cool, just to air it out a bit. If at any chance you can air a down gear, I certainly wouldn't wash it in the laundromat, but you can certainly sort of give it a bit more boost of loft. And I do that same thing with my puffy jacket as well. If it's been through maybe a couple of rainy or damp situations, and I get a chance to go to town in the laundromat, I just shove them in after I've done all my washing and drying. I just shove them in for another maybe 5 or 10 minutes on cool, just to give them a little fluffing up, if you like, to recover them on trail. I very rarely have had to wash a quilt or down bag on trail, and I would urge you caution doing that. If you do find a situation where, I don't know, you're ill, or you really get soiled in some way in which you really have to wash it, then my advice for that would be, one, be very, very careful whenever you have down and it gets wet. Certainly in a washing situation, it puts pressure, and you lift it up and down and you shake it around, you can put pressure on the seams of your quilt, and they're not designed to take a lot of pressure, so be very careful when you wash a quilt. I use a reputable down wash. I would normally buy it from a camping store. If I had to do that, I would do it in town, where I would take my quilt. In this particular case, I would gently hand wash it in the bathtub, following the water instructions. I would gently make it get the down wet, and it does take a while to get down wet in a sleeping bag. You basically got air pockets, so you're going to be fighting that in your bathtub, but you can do a wash and then a gentle rinse of water. Again, don't squeeze it, just pat it down in the bathtub, shallow water in the bathtub with the wash and then the rinse, and then gently squeeze the residual water out after a rinse. You'll see how dirty the water is, because most of the time your sleeping system will pick up a lot of dirt. And then I would use a towels of the hotel to literally gently squeeze the last remnants of the moisture as much as I can out of the damp, or hopefully now damp and rinsed quilt. And then I would straight away gently put it in the bag. Try not to put too much weight on the seams, and take it to a laundromat where I would put it on air dry, on cool air dry, and be prepared there. Be there at the laundromat for a good few hours, because it takes several hours to properly dry, multiple hours to dry a quilt. And if you can get hold of a couple of furry tennis balls, shove them in there, and as it's drying, gently open the door and break up some of the down as it starts to dry, because it starts clumping. You're going to have to manually do that as it's washing and drying. It's a process that I would urge you only do that as a last resort, because it is risking your sleep system not to have it cleaned professionally, or if you've not experienced in doing this. The main problem is if you, as I said, you're putting pressure on the seams. I had to do that once on trail, but I always wash my quilt when I get home at the end of a through hike every year, and it does fluff up back to pretty much back to where it was as new. And this is 4 seasons old, and I've been very careful washing it. But I would urge you, caution, not to do it. If you have to do it on trail, be careful and take time. You probably need a full zero to do it. Okay, one last thing I thought about on quilts or sleeping bags is that you might occasionally get a nick and you start to see feathers coming out, and that might develop into a tear of some kind. One thing I found with seam seal tape, as I mentioned in previous videos from Z-Packs, is that it's very thin and flexible in such a way that you can actually hopefully stop any tears from developing and becoming longer, certainly on a quilt, just using a strip of seam seal tape. And because it's so flexible, it will actually, you can massage it into the fabric of the sleep system. If you use tenacious tape, because tenacious tape is slightly more rigid, it's much harder to do. So just keep in mind that seam seal tape is great for multiple repairs on not only your tent, if you have a DCF tent, but it's also useful on your sleep system and also puffy jackets as well. Anyway, right. What do you couple with your sleeping bag is you couple it with a sleeping pad. Now, you're going to see a lot of people carrying these things. These are closed cell foam pads. Now, if I was 20 or 30, then I find these reasonably comfortable. Problem is, as you get older, my sleep patterns change and I become much more of a side sleeper. So I find that I personally can't use these. I don't sleep very well on these. I don't get a good night's sleep at all, really. And they're also a bit more fiddly to make them work with a quilt. I tend to go for sleeping pads. Now, these are insulated inflatable pads. Now, I've got a range here. I've used loads of what are called thermarest ones, and depending on the design, you can have very thin pads or very thick pads, and there's different levels of insulation and tin foil in there and things like that gives you different thermal ratings. And you'll hear people talking about R ratings of sleeping bags. It just happens to be a number. It happens to be a standard that can vary between manufacturers, but I would typically go for a sleeping pad for the PCT of between an R value of between 2 and 4. That would be typical. If I know it's going to be a very cold year, lots of snow, then I might even go for a 4 or a 5, but they're thicker pads than they're heavier pads. So, by way of example, this just happens to be a Thermarest ProLite Plus. This is an interesting design in the fact it's inflatable, but it also has insulation in there as well. You can get just pads which are purely inflatable. Now, you can have a Thermarest ones. There's lots of very light versions there. This is a Nemo air pad, and this is a Climate pad. Now, this is an unusual design in the fact that it has almost like a herringbone type shape of air channels, whereas a lot of the pads you'll find literally just have basically it's a mattress and it's kind of flat. They might have tubes going down or tubes going across. This one happens to have tubes going sort of as I said, in like a U shape all the way down. What you find is that sometimes just the standard pads which you sleep in and you basically sink in the middle work fine for most people. But if you're like me and you slightly have unusual sleep conditions whereby I sleep on my side, I tend to find that sometimes where the tubing or the design of the pad actually can make a difference to how well you sleep. And I've used ProLite Plus, but this is, as I said, this is an R rating of I think it's RAL rating 4, this particular one. So it's good thermal insulation. But look how big it is, because it's got extra thermal insulation compared to, say, this guy. So you can actually go thinner. This actually has only a rating of, I think, just under 2, I think, so it's lower. But I find that this one works well with me with my quilt on an average year. As I said, you can get lighter ones from Thermarest. I think the lightest ones now are getting almost silly in terms of almost like paper thin, but they seem to work, and you can see hikers using these pretty much for the whole trail without too much issue. The thing I would say with some of these pads is that you're probably going to have to buy one, commit to one, and you may find that the first choice may not work for you. I appreciate it's very hard because it really depends on how you sleep, and if you're a comfortable sleeper and a simple sort of a pad that sinks in the middle is fine for you, you're not going to roll off, that works fine. If you're a side sleeper, or you're a cold sleeper, you may have to have a pad that's slightly thicker and maybe slightly heavier. But I think most of the time I would say if you're going to buy something. Thermarest is generally a good brand, but I've got Nemo's and I've got Climats here. My first 2 pads were Thermarest, and I was reasonably happy with those. And if you want to go light, obviously there are some. Depends on how much you're willing to spend. The other thing to consider is you've got inflatable pads that you have to blow up. Now, not all these pads come with, or come either with or optional with a pump sack. So it's basically a big bag that you can fill up with air using the Bernoulli effect, which is basically a simple way of blowing up the air, putting air in a bag, and then you can use that to pump up your inflatable pad. And some people use sort of mini electrical pumps, air pumps, to pump up your inflatable pad. Why on earth do people do that? I do not know, but that's your personal choice. As I said, this is my personal opinion. I too tend to giggle when I see people using a pump on trail if you're going through a thru-hike. If you love that, then okay, I fully understand. I would consider that a very high-end luxury item, but that's your personal choice. I can say with reasonable certainty that pump sacks, these free sacks, are probably one of the most dropped items in hiker boxes in the early stages of a thru hike on the PCT. I did walk through Lake Morena this year, and there were 6 pump sacks in the hiker box at the ranger station at Lake Morena, and they said, yep, we get these sacks regularly. So I really wouldn't bother with them, and to be perfectly honest, I wouldn't bother with an air pump, but it is your personal choice. If you have a repair kit, I would carry that with you. It is quite common that you might get the odd puncture in an inflatable pad. They normally come with glue dots, if you like, that you have to massage into the hole. You can normally relatively easily find the holes or punctures in at a town stop. If you're very lucky, you might find some still water. I did actually have to do that once on trail. The thing I would say that causes most punctures are usually something that is avoidable. Early stages where you have the desert sections, there are these seed pods. I think I mentioned them before, where you have tiny seed pods but with very, very sharp spikes on, and they do attach to your trail running shoes as you're hiking through the desert, and it's very easy to walk them or transfer them inside your tent. At night when you're bringing your shoes in, just be very careful. I would inspect the base of your shoes when you go to sleep, just before you enter the tent, and pick off any of these goat head spikes. Sometimes you might get cactus spines in your socks or in your gaiters, so be very careful there. It does happen. It's very hard to avoid, but some of the simple checks might save you. The other common, certainly in my experience, where I've damaged sleeping pads is where I've been wearing gear like a coat or something, or a puffy jacket, and my zip has actually got between me and my pad, and me rolling over like this has actually caused a little nick from the metal element of the zip. And I did happen to be one occasion where I literally turned over and I could think, hang on, something's snagging, and then pop, and you could hear the air brushing straight away. I mean, you could see immediately it was the zip had caught. So just be wary of that kind of thing. But the on-trail repairs can be relatively easy, but you're probably going to find yourself doing that in town. The other thing I would say is if you find that you're having problems with your sleeping pad, that you can't find it as a puncture, and it might be a valve issue, or it might be a slightly, some pads actually can delaminate, might just be from a manufacturing issue. Don't be too afraid to try and just ring up the manufacturer, even when you're on trail or in town, and just say, look, you're having a problem. Depending on the situation, you might be lucky, and they might just say that's fine, just send us a photograph, and if they can see a problem that is obviously something they're willing to accept, they might just say, look, we'll send you a new pad, what's the next town? And I've heard of hikers getting brand new pads for legitimate reasons on trail, and the manufacturer said, look, we fully accept it, here's a new pad. So don't be afraid to try that. Other things I would say is I tend to use a 1/8" foam pad. I think these are from Granite Gear. These are just these very thin pads, and most people think, why on earth do people carry that kind of pathetic kind of pad? There's two reasons. One is that it's useful for putting underneath your main sleeping pad, because on some tents they have these very slippery, slidey basins, and you can find that your sleeping pad can slide up and down whilst you're sleeping. If you have the foam pad, or call it the 1/8" pad on the ground between your sleep pad and the basin of your tent, it actually acts as a friction block, and it stops you sliding around. It also is very, very light and serves also as a sit pad, and on occasions I've actually used one of those thin pads, and I've cut it up a shoe shape such that when one of my insoles was getting very compressed, I actually did a double layer of that foam pad and shoved it in my shoes, and that allowed me to get to town so I could buy a new insole. But again, it's very cheap pads, and it's something that you may or may not want to use, but a lot of hikers tend to just default to carry that kind of simple foam pad system, but it doesn't add anything in terms of anything real in terms of thermal insulation on the ground. The other thing you might see people using are pillows. Now, you can get a multitude of inflatable pillows of different designs. Some have like nice furry bags. Some have nice sort of curved shapes. I did hike a couple of times with sleep pillows, but I ended up dumping it in a hiker box, and it is one of those items that are commonly dumped in hiker boxes, because what you can do is I do find that I just either use my puffy jacket as a pillow, or I will put puffy jacket and maybe some clothes in a clothing bag and use that as a sort of a manufactured sleep pillow. I do need some sort of head support, but I found that using a clothing bag stuffed with the clothing is a sufficient way of doing it for me. It worked fine for me. You might also think about, when it comes to pads, do I go for the full length? Do I go for a wide? Do I go for a 3/4 length? I tend now, if I do buy a new pad, I tend to go for either a 3/4 regular, or I may go for the women's size, the lady size. I do find that with the quilt, because most of the time it comes up to my feet and it covers my feet reasonably well, I don't need to have a full length pad. But again, that's a personal choice that you might find. But if you're uncertain, I'd probably just go for the full length ones. But I find with practice, a 3/4 length or a woman's size works for me. But again, personal choice. Okay, so I hope that sort of general discussion is helpful to you. Whether you settle on a quilt or a bag, I hope you find a design that works for you. If you are going for filling, I would urge you to go for down if you're going for a long-term purchase, and look after it, and it can last you a long time and multiple through hikes if you're willing to make that spend. And also it's lighter compared to synthetic. Sleeping pads, as I said, you've got various ratings. Now, I do understand that a lot of people, you'll have some people who feel the cold more, and that initial advice on maybe a 20-degree might vary for people who feel the cold more, and I do understand that. So I hope the discussions are just helpful to you initially. You are going to have to do some dialing in on your shakedown hikes. You may find that whatever you buy, you might need that little extra warmth, and you may have to settle to have a liner on trail for certain parts of the trail. And what you can do is you can put that in your bounce box or your post box and post it to you, or carry it when you need it, and post it forward if you're going through sections where you don't need it. So don't worry too much about getting things absolutely perfect first time round. There is going to be a little bit of dialing in that you're going to have to do individually. Okay, I hope this is helpful, and I will be moving on to the next video, which is going to be talking about backpacks, and then after that I will then go to more general gear and smaller items, and talk about some of the gear and the variables that are important to me for the other items of gear that you will use on your thru hike. So, speak to you soon.